I think one of the great things to get over creative block is to publish your work, put it out there. Although I've been painting for years and I'm an Archer Wall finalist, I still, at the beginning of COVID, I started doing a painting a day, a watercolor a day. And they were just basic little watercolor sketches of everyday objects. And it took me 2 months to have the courage to put them on my Instagram account because I didn't want people to judge me, But once I did that, and then people went, "Oh, I love these, I can't wait for the one tomorrow." All of a sudden, I've created an expectation, a deadline from the public.
Do you want to unlock your inner child's creativity? Then this chapter of the Business Library is made just for you. So I have Paul on here today, and we're going to be discussing the creative process, how to overcome creative blocks, so you can start elevating your business with creativity. Such a beautiful thing. But to put your own words on it, Paul, what made you choose to work with creativity of all things?
Well, Mass, I think creativity chose me. Look, I think the reality is, and you talk about, the inner child, or, I was lucky in as much when I had, some drawing ability, some visual art ability. And so in my teenage years, I wasn't discouraged and I was encouraged by certain people. So I retained that creative confidence to do that. A lot of people get discouraged or don't have any encouragement for any sort of creative output. And I've certainly had that experience in some aspects of creativity, but I was very lucky. So basically, I've always, I suppose, been connected with creativity. I did architecture, which, has an element, there's a lot of creativity in that. There's also a lot of grunt work to get a building done, but there's a lot of creativity. And I've, always pursued, the artistic. So I think it chose me.
It's funny how, at least from my experience hosting this podcast, is most of the time your true passion, your special source, kind of more finds you, and you find it can't really be forced. Though that can be very frustrating sometimes when you really want to find it, which for some reason feels like push it away even more. But you've done a lot of things when it comes to creativity. I remember we talked a little bit on an earlier conversation about you started out with public speaking, and then you went into writing, which kind of got me really confused. That's either people do one or the other. So how can you manage to do both and be good at both?
Well, look, I think the writing, it's interesting. And the story of my writing is I'm dyslexic and I really struggled with English at school. I had, I suppose, a secret desire, a dream to be a writer, but I really thought I could never do that because I really struggled with writing. And as an architect, I found business writing difficult. So in the end, about 10 years ago, I'd sold my architectural practice and I was doing this public speaking and training. And a friend of mine was putting together a design book, and it was for product design, which I'd done a little bit of, but not a lot. And so I didn't have enough to go in there in my own right as a designer for product design. But he asked me to write a piece. And I said, look, I'd love to. And I'm quite, honored that you've asked me, but I just can't write. It's impossible. And he said to me, look, I've got a great editor. Why don't you just talk to her and just see, he sort of suggested that maybe she could even ghostwrite it, because I'm a good talker. And so I said, okay. Reluctantly, I agreed to speak to his editor. And we had a conversation, and she said to me, Paul, look, I love your ideas. I love your thinking. Just jump off this call and write. Pretty well almost stream of consciousness. Just put down your thoughts. It doesn't matter if it's bullet point or no punctuation. Don't worry about spelling. And just send it to me. And then I'll have something we can work from. At least we have something, and we can see. So anyway, I did that. I just did it. If I procrastinated, I wouldn't have ever done it. I sent it off to her. And about 2 days later, the guy that was commissioning the book called me. And he said, mate, I read your piece. And I was just like, what the hell? No, I was so embarrassed. And I immediately went to, he's ringing me to say, yeah, look, you're right. You're a crap writer. You're out. We can't do anything with this. I was absolutely horrified. And he said, mate, loved it. He said it was fantastic. And it actually ended up going into the book with very little editing. So I just realized that I could write, and it was different to what I experienced. And so it opened up a door for me. But what I've realized also is that, and you mentioned about public speaking, and I think where I'd gone wrong is that, the best speakers who look like, they do it off the cuff, have written that and practiced and practiced and practiced. So I think writing, precedes so many things we do, and obviously so many things like blogging and stuff, require writing. But even vlogging or presenting, even presenting at a meeting or a keynote, all require writing to start. And so me being a visual person, it's really opened up, my world, because I now combine an image with writing, and that writing is about stories and ideas coming together. And so it's really opened up my world, and it's also made me realize that if I can learn to write, then probably anyone can. I also believe anyone can draw or be taught to paint. In fact, we can all draw. If you pick up a pencil and make a mark on a bit of paper and it's not a word, it's drawing. Yet people say I can't draw. Well, we can all draw. If you got hands or legs, if you don't even have hands or legs, you've got a mouth. You can still draw.
Yeah.
And I think that, but people don't believe me because they say, well, you're a good drawer. It's easy for you to say. But so it's much more easier for me to say, well, I can help you learn to write because I'm dyslexic and I only discovered I could write 10 years ago. So if I can do it, you can do it.
I remember regarding the speeches. At one time, I've heard a guy, he talked about how to deliver a great speech, and it was about practicing it so much that it didn't sound planned anymore. It sounded like it just came up the cuff, with most people only going to be able to achieve that kind of greatness by practicing and just doing it over and over and over again.
Correct. And that really is the thing. And I think so many people, those people are so good at it, they go, I want to be like him. I want to be charismatic and quick-witted, and I can do that. Now, some people are, some people are geniuses like that. I met the late great Robin Williams, the comedian, at a TED conference years ago, and he was at the time a really keen cyclist, and he used to cycle with Lance Armstrong, who was before he was disgraced, and they used to cycle up together. And at the time, I cycled a lot. I was obsessed about it. And, I would do 100K every weekend and 200 some weekends. And anyway, there was a joke, and there was two jokes. One was that I was a mammal, which was a middle-aged man in Lycra. But the other one was that if you're obsessed with cycling, you said that you suffered from, or that you had cyclist. And so I was on the forecourt at the TED conference one day, and Robin Williams was there. And I went up to him to tell him this joke because I knew that he'd be there, and I've been practicing this joke for months. So I went up and we got chatting, and I had this great hat, and he was wearing my hat, and we're having a laugh. And I said to him, look, I believe you, do a fair bit of writing. I said, I have cyclist. And he said, mate, don't worry about that. He said, I'm a pedal file.
It's a good response, that one.
So just like that, and I, he was probably a person that could get up and talk for 2 hours without rehearsing, and it'd be amazing, and it'd be incredible. But I think that practice is really important. But then it does give you the confidence that you can actually get up and speak and be a little bit more ad lib. I think the thing is, and I have a sort of a system, and it's more a leadership system, but what it comes to, but it has an analogy to writing, which is that we have a script, and as a leader, we have a script, and there are three different types of scripts, and a lot of the confusion comes from when the leader hasn't clarified what sort of script it is. So the first script is the full-blown script. This is the way we're doing it. This is the words. This is how we're going. The next script is an ad lib script. So the ad lib script is, look, here's the script, but you want to add some bits, great. If you get a moment of genius, you can add it in. You're allowed to ad lib. And then the last bit, which I suppose in some ways is the most fun, but not always possible, and it depends on what particular stage you're at a project, is the improv script, which means there's no script. We're going to make it up as we go along. So a big challenge, and this isn't literally necessary writing, although, it can have a writing component. It is about making people understand, for whatever reason, that, okay, this is the script. I know that I would like your ideas, but we don't have time, or I'm very keen. I know exactly what the client wants. So there's no ad-libbing and there's no improv here. Where a lot of frustration comes from when leaders talk about, having an open dialogue and everything, and people think that it's always improv. And when they get shut down and the leader says, no, do it this way, they get disgruntled. So it's a really important thing for a leader, and this is really about creativity, that sometimes for some particular reasons, you need to have a script and you've got to follow the script. But wherever you can, allow people to ad lib or to improv.
I think it's always a good idea if you have a script and not just, at least I like to do it, play out the conversation, the video, the speech. Just how do I want it to play out? What do I want to say? What are some few things I want to cover? Just to have a bit of an idea. But I also know I'm a guy that can go on a tangent out of nowhere, and we're going to go on a completely different subject that had nothing to do with the original subject within 5 minutes, and I've forgotten all about
where you were starting. But it's interesting, podcasts, we've all got our styles, and my podcast, the Common Creative, we don't have a lot of structure. We used to have a bit of a structure. We used to ask people for a story, an idea, and an image. We don't do that anymore. We ask them at the first, give us 30-second, 60-second potted history about how you got to where you are, and then we go from there. But I've been on other podcasts where they send, the one guy, an Australian guy, Nigel Mars, had a thing called 5 of My Life. And so it gives you a question beforehand. You've got to give him your favorite book, your favorite song, your favorite place, I think a memory and something else. And so it's very structured, but it does go, off piste, at times. It does vary, and he'll bring up other stuff and throw stuff, to you. So it is interesting.
And sometimes that just brings out interesting conversations, and I found sometimes, because I do have like a bit of an idea, like a few outline questions that I want to ask, but sometimes the conversation goes in a bit the way you could ever imagine. So it's important to be able to do that improv.
Yep.
I remember I learned it in like an online room where we were sitting at like 12 a.m. and we were just doing weird noises and making up a story where people had to jump in all over the time, and we're just having a good time. But it taught you a whole bunch about just think off the cuff, don't think about too much about what comes up. But to also go a little bit into creative blocks, what is some good ways you've found to overcome those creative blocks when we can't think of the next thing, we just feel stuck?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question. And, besides my, creative practice, I've also done a lot of research and study into creativity. And lots of people have different, ideas and version about this. Some people say, there's a famous author whose name escapes me, says that, some people, say that you have to have, inspiration. He said, lucky for me, inspiration always turns up at 9 a.m. every morning. If you talk to someone that writes for television, say, I don't have the privilege or the luxury of having writer's block because I've got a deadline at 5 o'clock, or journalists. So I think that, I think one of the things is that, and look, it is a complicated subject. I work alone, and I would at times probably say that I have, some form of creative block, but it's really probably more of a lack of direction or deadline, the lack of a deadline. So I think to have a deadline, even if it's self-imposed, is a really good way, and it harks back to those journalists with their 5 o'clock deadline, is a really good way to get over creative block. I think that I have a story. I'm a painter, and years ago, 25 years or 24 years ago now, and I'm still dining out on this story, I did a painting which is a tribute to a friend of mine that had passed away, and it was selected for Australia's premier portrait prize, which has been running for 130, 140 years in Australia. And there's, around 1,000 entries minimum, and they select 30. And I was one of 30. And so it was a really big deal. And I'd done a painting that had meaning. Up at that point, I had a fairly solid part-time art career, but I showed, in galleries, sellout shows, but mostly painted some landscapes and still life fruit. And people who wanted to be disparaging would call me a decorative artist. And I had painted this portrait that had been, recognised or acknowledged. I didn't win, but it was acknowledged. And I basically, when I came home, I had a real difficulty going back in the studio and painting fruit. I was looking for more meaning. And a friend of mine who was an artist gave me some great advice. Yenda Carson's her name. And she said to me, just get into the studio and play. Don't think about, an audience. Don't think about meaning. Just put the paints on the palette and just play, which is what I did. It got me over the block. What she didn't tell me, which is probably the next part of the advice, is you don't have to show those works. And I did show those works, and it was probably my least successful show. So, there's a lesson there, but I think that's one of the things. And I suppose the first thing is to look at the reason, because, there's a story, there's always a story, but there's a story associated with that Archibald Prize portrait. So I went to the opening, the announcement in Sydney, and as I said, I didn't win. And there were about 30 artists there, and after the announcement, they all went to the pub. Now, what I didn't realise is that the community of artists that were there was a very close shop, mostly Sydney, Melbourne. I'm from Brisbane. Very rarely someone from Brisbane in it. And most often at that time, and the prize is different now, the same artists would be shown every year in, year out, either as artists or subjects, about 70 to 80% from Sydney or Melbourne. So they knew each other. In the lead up to this prize, I had a practice of doing a portrait a day. In fact, I was doing 2. I was doing a self-portrait, and I was doing one of a friend or a family member. And I'd done it for about 2 months. And I went to the pub with these artists, and they all started drawing each other on beer coasters. And it was amazing. And so here I am, I'm one of them, and I'm been honing my skill of doing drawings. And you know what happened? I froze. I could not join. I was so intimidated by them because, these were well-known people that, I knew their work, and I was really intimidated. So, and basically I didn't do it. The worst that could have happened was they just told me to get nicked. But most likely I would have got some amazing portraits by Australia's most famous artists. And so I think that was, in part a creative block. I had a block, and that block was my fear of intimidation, or that wasn't good enough. So I think that probably, if you've got a serious block, if you've got any block, the best thing to do is just start. We had a famous Australian artist, Arthur Boyd, who died a few years ago. But whilst he was still living, he was probably Australia's, greatest, some age, living artist. And I read this article. In that article, he said that every day I face a blank canvas and I channel Shakespeare's words from King Lear. He says, "Nothing will come of nothing." And I know that I have to start. And if I start, then something will come. If I don't start, nothing will come. So I think the simplest answer is to just start. And whatever it might be, and if you're a musician, pick up the guitar and start plucking away. If you're an artist, just start doodling or drawing. Do something to start. However, if that doesn't work, ask the question about, what sort of block or where does it comes from? Is it about fear? Is it about laziness? Is it about lack of direction? When I was a kid, I'd always say to my mother, what should I paint? What should I paint? What should I paint? And the answer is, she probably said paint anything, but just pick up your brush and put a mark on the paper, and then, and that's painting, and go from there. So, look, it's a real thing, but I think that, the common thing that I find from people I read is that most people, especially if they're creative for their business or their livelihood, they don't have the luxury of creative blocks because they got deadlines.
That's true. All of a sudden, something magical comes out of nowhere just because you have to. You put yourself in a position where you don't really have the choice. And that also just forces you to put whatever you have. The first thing that comes to mind, this is just going there. I need something, and I need it now. I would have liked it a couple hours ago, so let's just get it done.
Look, exactly. And I think it is about the process. It's hard if you've got a deadline and, to do something. When I paint, I expect every paint to be not necessarily a masterpiece, but, something that people would recognize. I think one of the great things to get over creative block is to publish your work, put it out there. Although I've been painting for years and I'm an Archer Wall finalist, I still, at the beginning of COVID, I started doing a painting a day, a watercolor a day. And it took me, and they were just basic little watercolor sketches of everyday objects. And it took me 2 months to have the courage to put them on my Instagram account because I didn't want people to judge me, But once I did that, and then people went, "Oh, I love these, I can't wait for the one tomorrow." All of a sudden, I've created an expectation, a deadline from the public. But there's something about that, especially if it's around creative confidence, to get it out in the world and accept that, some people might like it, some people might not like it. The reality is most people aren't really looking anyway.
That's true.
No one's paying attention to you. So it doesn't really matter. Just, get something out into the world. And it might not be perfect, but, you get feedback. And that's the thing. I think that for the solo artist, sometimes it's very hard to get feedback. And you've got to be careful not to publish too early. But there's, once you publish something, put into the world, it creates a conversation. And so it adds a sort of a low level meaning to your work because someone might be inspired by it, and so all of a sudden it has a bit of meaning, and it gives you a bit more of a purpose of why I'm creating. Because I think that I was reading a book the other day. I started reading a book called Why something about great readers. I think it's called Great Readers Write. In that book, he said every time you write, ask the question, why am I writing this? What is the purpose of writing? And I think that it's, particularly writing, I think it's a good thing because, we can do stuff. But I think at other times it's okay to play, but it's okay. You need to say, well, I'm just writing this because I'm playing. I'm exploring, I'm using writing as an iterative way to clarify my thinking.
And sometimes, at least I've found, when you just play and you decide to publish it anyway, you'll actually be surprised of how many people likes it. Because you didn't try to do your usual thing. It's a bit different and unique. And I also think there's a beauty in intentionally putting yourself in a position where if you were in your own shoes, you would be judging whatever you're doing. I have an example where I wrote down a list of like seven things that made me uncomfortable, and they got progressively worse. And I told myself the deadline is one a week, so just do one of them a week, doesn't matter. Just also helped me to ease into it. I probably wouldn't have started with the last one, because at that point that was like filming a video in a public train that was filled with people. And I live in Denmark, so English is not the first language. Still nowadays, when I do a voice note to somebody in public, people are like, huh? What? What's this guy doing? Just because I walk around like speaking English in public. So with the phone out there, even more weird. And for sure, I got some weird glances, but I was definitely too nervous to pay attention to it, but I must have gotten them. But then walking away from that train, because I did it just before I had to, I didn't want to stay in there any longer than I had to afterwards. For sure, that was an absolute no. I realized I'm not going to see any of these people again. Their opinions doesn't really matter. So why am I so afraid of their judgment? Everybody's entitled to their own opinion. Let them have it. If they don't like you, that's okay. There's 7-8 billion people in the world. Probably find a few that's gonna like you because by being you, it's gonna be a lot easier to maintain. But going into the process of creativity, is there a process to it, or is it free flowing? It flows just through you, in your opinion?
Look, I think Maz said it's both. It's basically there is a process, but there's also there is also inspiration that seems to come from nowhere. So, and I suppose it's just what I suppose what you think of creativity is. So, you know, I think that I have two definitions that I rely on. One is from Einstein that creativity is seeing what everyone else has seen, but thinking what no one else has thought. And that for me is like the inspiration of creativity. But I rely on another quote as well from a guy, David Brooks, who wrote a book called How to Know a Person. And in that book, he says to know a person well is an act of deep creativity. And he unpacks it a little bit differently in the book. But what I take it from it is very similar to what Einstein was saying, is that to see someone well, we must, drop our biases or our prejudgments, because ultimately that's how we can connect with a person, and that person's got to feel safe that they can drop their mask, because ultimately creativity in its fullest form is about connection, and that often needs a process. So individually we have ideas, but in a tribe we have innovation in our team. So I got an idea, and if I can sell it to the team, then it becomes innovation, and that's a creative process. So I suppose it depends on what you do, but even I don't paint a lot in oil anymore, because oil has a particular process or technique, and it's about fat over lean. And if you put too much dry paint over paint with a lot of oil in it, then it'll crack over time. Or if you happen to be a master from 300 or 400 years ago, it'll crack anyway over time. But so that's a sort of a process. Design thinking, which has come up over the last 15 years, which is really is what what architects do. All that's always a process. It's ideation and inspiration, and then you've got to look at things, and revision, and then iteration and action, and so there is a process. And I think that, but individually we all have a bit of a process. There's an amazing little 5 or 10 minute video of Roald Dahl. I don't know if you know Roald Dahl is a famous author. Wrote all the kids' books. He wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
I know that.
A lot of famous movie, Matilda. He also wrote some adult books. But he had a studio, was yellow, in his garden. And this video was him going down to his studio, and he goes in, and there's this little room, and it's messy as hell. He's got this armchair, and he's got a heater because it's cold wherever he lives. And he's got this board that he's made that sits on this armchair. And over here, he's got his pencils, and he's got a pencil sharpener, and he's got a brush, and he brushes his board, because he uses, and he's got a razor, and he's got his pad, and he's got his cup of tea, and he sets it up, and he just starts writing, and he writes freehand, or he did when he was alive, and he'd erase, and that's why then he'd brush it again. He had a real set process. So I think that, if you'd asked me this 20 years ago, I went, forget process. I think that, his was a process, but it was also a routine. And the more and more I'm finding is that creatives to create something need routine, because left to our own devices, there's far too many distractions in the world, and we end up, not getting anything done. So yeah, I think that, I think there's elements of both. And there is some that free form playing doesn't need a process. But generally, I think most artists that create any sort of body of work, or any creative, and this also includes, applied creativity in business and problem solving, needs a process.
You're so right in saying that. And looking at my own life, there's definitely certain areas where I'm the most creative. It's not sitting in front of my PC when I write a podcast. If I go outside and sit outside, I'm a lot more creative. It just feels like with there being no roof for some reason, that there is less limit to the creativity. If I really have to get down where sitting in front of the PC, it's more of like focus, let's get some stuff knocked off the list. Where creative work sometimes takes a bit longer because all of a sudden, light bulb moment, idea comes in out of nowhere. Scrap everything, we're doing this instead. Happens from time to time. But talking about this creative process made me also want to ask you if you have that creative square next to you had last time.
Yeah, I have this.
Because that actually really piqued my curiosity when we
Is this
last
one?
time. Yeah, no, for all the people listening on Spotify, click on YouTube instead so you actually see this part. But yeah, I see framework.
Yeah. So look, what it is to describe it, it's essentially a viewfinder that artists use, and so it's a square. It's about 4 inches or 100 centimeters, and it's got a grid of 3x3 inside with fine lines cut out. And artists use it to hold up to see a view, and then they have that same grid on their piece of paper, and then they use that to sort of mark their drawings. Now, this has been used for hundreds of years, and there are even some more, like the camera obscura, more technical things that artists use. They believe in the Renaissance and the Dutch masters. But this is a twofold thing. So my framework that I have here is also my framework that I use. And so just to describe it, there's 3 columns and 3 rows. On the columns are past, present, and possibility. So the past is where our story lives, and it's through our stories and retelling our stories that we can find meaning and make connections, because there's a whole lot of neuroscience that comes from what happens when we tell someone a story, which we can go into if we have time. The present is about clarity. It's about what's in front of us, what's really important, getting clear about what matters in your life. And it's where we can take challenges and turn them into opportunities. Then the possibility is the future. It's called possibility because it works with my alliteration of past, present, and possibility. But I see possibility as where ideas live. And it's through ideas that we can make a difference and add value. So I see that where the heart of creativity lives. Now, when we look across these 3 things, it's really sort of a thinking framework, because if we allow these 3 thinking things to get muddled up, we then start to regret the past. And when we regret the past, it sort of shakes our confidence a bit. I made a bad decision, or I went the wrong way, or I didn't get the opportunity. And so then we basically, we get anxious about the future, and we lose confidence. And when that happens, we get very confused about what's important. So we lose focus about what really matters to it in our life. Now, we can do that thinking, which is really an extension of rumination, as individuals, as teams. We start blaming, and we get confused about what's important, and we're too scared of ideas. So that's the framework, and the opportunity is, when we spread this thinking out, is to look at the past and say, well, okay, that didn't work well. How would we do it different? So learn lessons from the past, but also often our past stories have totally different meanings to when we experience that story to where we are now. And so something happened as a child to me might have had a great impact, but I can now, as an adult, look at it and go, well, that had no real meaning. And I can change the meaning of that story from something that, was like, well, this happened, and so therefore, I can never do this, as opposed to this happened, and therefore that has given me the challenge. That was the most uncomfortable thing, like you were saying about picking 7 things. So I said, I'm going to do this now, and that's led to my success. And when we do that, we can actually gives us confidence about the future, and so we're much more secure, which then allows us to get really focused on what really matters. So they're the timelines. The horizontal bands are really the sort of goes from the micro to the macro. So the bottom one is A, which is about autonomy or agency, which is about you. So this is where creativity lives, where creative expression, where freedom, where agency lives. So B is the next level up, which is the middle level, which is about bonding or belonging. And that's about your team or your tribe. And then C, which is about our is about context. And context is about anything that's not yourself personally in A or B for your team or your whatever what team or your tribe. It might be community. It's most often company. It also can be candidates, or it could be a cause or a calling. So it's anything that's greater than the team. So I use this framework when I work with businesses, and I run a series of exercises that live in either one or more of these squares. So, for instance, I do an exercise where people have to do a drawing of where they've been, where they are, and where they want to go to, what their ideas of the future are. And so that's the bottom line. What's their story? What is important to them? And what are their ideas for the future? So that's the framework. And it just so happens that I also, in my workshops, I teach people how to paint a lemon. I choose a lemon because lemon's been a thing in art for hundreds of years, but also under my tutelage, people get a painting of a lemon, not a lemon of a painting. And they use this framework to help them draw one version of the lemon. And it also happens to be the framework that we're working in terms of clarifying our thinking about, where stories live, where ideas live, and where action lives, which is that place of taking challenges to opportunities.
I thought they drew lemons just because it was easy to draw lemons, but you learned there's a deeper meaning to it. But I heard you say something about neuroscience, and that piques my interest instantly. So we have time.
Okay.
Now we have time after I heard that, definitely.
So it's really interesting, because we've had on our podcast, The Common Creative, we've had quite a few neuroscientists, and two in particular we had. One was a guy called Yuri Hasson, who has done an amazing TED Talk, and you can search him. It's URI Hasson, and he's a professor of neuroscience at Princeton University, and he's got a great TED Talk. And he talks about what happens in neuroscience with stories. So they did this study, and they put people in the fMRI machine and got them to watch a movie. And the movie was a brand new movie that hadn't been released. So they watched it and they scanned their brain. So then what they did was they put the person back into the machine and got them to explain the movie and then scan the brain. Then they put a third person or second person into the machine and then played them, not the movie, but played them the recording of this person explaining the movie. And what they found was that when they look at those three recordings of the brain patterns, they're all incredibly similar. So what it means is that if you are able to tell a story and repeat a story, you basically can implant or imprint that story into someone else's brain, which is really quite amazing. And it's a great sort of insight, but it doesn't stop there, because we've also some other people in the podcast, and particularly a lady, Selena Bartlett, who's an Australian neuroscientist, and she's done a lot of stuff around addiction and things, but also ideas. And she told us that what happens is that when people brainstorm and ideate, the reverse happens. So I've got an idea, and then you've got another idea or a better idea or a different idea, and then someone else down the table, it sparks another idea. So, which is great when you're ideating for ideas, because you want to spark different thinking. But it's no good if you have an idea and you're trying to sell an idea. So you go to the boardroom, you go, I've got this great idea, and explain the idea, and the chairman goes, that's great. What about this? And so all of a sudden, the chairman or someone else or some junior burger in the meeting goes, what about that? And so all of a sudden they're doing their idea, not your idea, and that's hard. So the secret of selling ideas is to implant them into a story. So it's like if you have a pet, but if you've got to give a pet a piece of some medicine, you've got to put the tablet, inside a piece of meat and get them to chew it. Or kids in the old days, before they had liquid Panadol, used to get the Panadol and crush it up and put it into honey. So what you need to do is, if you really want to sell an idea, is to embed it in a story. Because when you embed it in a story, you actually can implant that idea into their head. So they've got the same brain waves as you, and it lessens their their ability to go, I've got a better idea, which is absolutely fine, but you don't want a better idea when you've gone through the ideation, you've selected the idea, you developed it, and it's ready to go to market, and then you fail because you spark someone else's idea. So that is really, and when I look at my model, why it's really important to spread the ideas and the stories, because they're very different things, and they come together in the middle because it's our experience and our inspiration that come together in the middle for our action to make things happen. So that's the neuroscience of ideas and stories.
That's actually a couple of cool facts I'm definitely grateful that I learned. And apparently stories are even more powerful than I thought. You can use them for even more things. I think there's no limit to stories. But for the people that want to start being more creative in their life or their business, what's the best place to reach you?
To reach me? Well, I'm on paulfairweather.com. I'm on LinkedIn as Paul Fairweather. My email address is hello@paulfairweather.com. So I'm really there. And look, I'm always happy to talk about creativity. I also have a podcast called The Common Creative with my co-host Chris Meredith, and it's called The Common Creative, and we're on a mission to open up the conversation about creativity in life and business through ideas, stories, and visual cognition. But it's really just ripping about creativity. So, but
if they enjoyed this one, I'm pretty sure they're going to enjoy that as well. But go ahead with your advice. Sorry for cutting you off.
My advice to anybody, is just start. And if you don't know what to start, the advice that I've taken from a fellow James Victoire, who wrote a fabulous book called Perfection, which is amazing. If you want a hard copy of it, it's out of print. So find out who the publisher is and send them a letter, because it's an amazing book. And he says, look at what made you weird as a kid, because that's what you should be doing. And another way is looking at, if you were always drawing as a kid, pick up a pencil. If you're always singing or acting, join an acting troupe. Because this is in life. And my thing is, and again, the neuroscience shows us that the brain can't really distinguish if we're, solving a creative artistic problem or a problem solving in a business sense. And any creative act, whether it's in business or in life or some sort of art form, does help rewire the brain to make creativity easier across the board. So my suggestion to people is certainly come and talk to me, but find out what it was that you did as a kid, either it made you weird or was your creative passion, and pick that up as a start. And that will help rewire your brain, which will make you more creative. It will open your mind to other things, because the other thing to do is to try things you're bad at. And if you're no good at it, it'll make you appreciate the other thing better, but it'll also help you become better at the other thing, because it's, again, expanded your mind, and it will make you more able to solve creative problems in a work situation.
It's funny how we came full circle. I ended up mentioning the inner child in the start. Now you talk about going back to what made you weird as a child.
Maybe this was scripted, Mads.
yeah, it was scripted. I hope that people believe that, because then we've done a fantastic job on this one. I'll say that much. And all the links to both your LinkedIn or your other social media, email, the podcast is going to be down below, so it's nice and easy for the people watching, because just like you, I'm dyslexic. So if people just sit there and spell it out, I'm like, nah, that's not important enough for me.
But I just make one more call out, and if you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to Maz's podcast, because that'll really help him get the message to the world. And and it's a great thing that he's doing all the way from Denmark. Here I am in Brisbane. So please subscribe to Maz's podcast. Hit the follow button.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much for coming on today, Paul.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed it, and thanks for the opportunity.